Hey again everybody, here is the last video in the tutorial series about if you're starting out shooting with a DSLR. So today is going to be combining shutter speed, aperture, ISO all into one so that you can shoot in manual and you control the exposure of your pictures, not necessarily the camera. So first step as always, let's turn on the camera. Next step is make sure you're in manual mode. So on the camera, manual mode of course is going to be the little M, and so if you have little dial switches, as you can see in this top left hand corner, it'll change the mode. So you want to be in M. Next, if you've watched the other tutorial videos, let's just cover real quick how to change the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO on your camera. So most cameras will have this little wheel right here. And as you can see in this box, that's changing the f-stop, which of course is the aperture. So first you need to choose what aperture you want to be shooting at. Most people usually go for the smallest aperture they can possibly get on probably most lenses people have. It's always about 2.8, or some have 3.5, maybe even f4. So you always want to choose the smallest aperture you can depending on what situation you're shooting on. Remember that the smaller the f-stop, the less depth of field you have, and most people like that to usually isolate a subject so that you don't see the background. And of course if you are doing a landscape or maybe in nature, etc., then you may want more depth of field. So first off, choose what depth of field you want. And as I said, most people with everything that they shoot, it's usually at a small f-stop, but don't necessarily always shoot at the smallest f-stop because you could have a picture where you need more depth of field. Next would be to choose your shutter speed. And your shutter speed depends on your lighting situation and what you're trying to do. Of course, usually if you're hand holding, remember you usually want to try and be 1/60th or more. And so if you don't know what your shutter speed is going to be, but you just know you want it to be fast enough with hand holding, what you can then do is use your exposure meter, and you'll have this inside your LCD screen in your camera. And if you push the shutter halfway down to focus, inside your camera there'll be a little green strip at the bottom underneath the actual viewfinder. And if you don't know what that is, then look through your camera right now, push the shutter halfway down, and you should see this right here, but in green. It may be in different colors. And as you can see, when I push the shutter halfway down, a little arrow right there points this way, which means that I'm underexposed. So then what I'd have to do is keep turning my shutter speed, and as you can see, it moves up until it's right in the middle. And when it's right in the middle, that's where what you're focusing on is perfectly exposed. That's what the camera's telling you, that's exposed. Now, if I were to do a faster shutter speed, it'll go to -1, which basically just means you're one stop underexposed. And if you, of course, go even slower, then it'll be over 1, which is one stop overexposed. And so, if you take a picture and it's not quite bright enough or it's not quite dark enough, you can always just drop it down a stop to 2 stops, or half a stop, etc., to get your perfect exposure. Now, if I was shooting, say, this table, which is in the background, at f4 to be properly exposed, it's saying it's 1/3 of a second, and that's too slow to be handheld, of course. So then what you could always do is turn up your ISO. Of course, I'm inside a house that is not properly lit, all that kind of good stuff. But when you're outside, it's usually probably going to be pretty sunny, or even if it's an overcast day, you're usually going to be at least at 1/100th of a second. And so, you can get something properly exposed. So basically, if you're outside, just choose your aperture and then push the shutter halfway down and scroll until this just lines up, and then there's your shutter speed. And as long as it's fast enough to be handheld, great. Now if you're, say, in a gymnasium and it's your high school or college basketball game, and you have a friend and they're like, hey, come take my picture. Well, in a gym it may not be quite as bright, so then what you can do is you can always change your ISO. So right now, say I want to shoot at 2.8, well, I'm at 1/6th of a second, which is way too slow for, say, hand holding. So then on the top of your camera, it's usually the easiest to change. What you can do is right here, it'll have a button, and most DSLRs will have this, and you hit ISO, and right here you can see on the top you can change it, or on the actual viewfinder you can change it. So if I hit ISO again, you use your little wheel at the top, and this also changes your shutter speed. It's this guy right here, and you just move that back and forth to change it. So say because you're inside at a game, you choose ISO 500 or 400, and then you push your shutter halfway again, all of a sudden I'm now overexposed because that shutter speed is too slow. So then you just dial it back in to get it properly exposed, and of course 1/25 is a little too slow, but that's just, you know, one thing you can do if you're inside or the sun is setting and it's, you know, a lower light and you don't have quite as much you know, available light in order to get a faster shutter speed. You know, just a quick tip is just change your ISO, and I would recommend you know, most cameras 100 or 200, just keep it at that ISO, and you know, you should be good to go. And so real quick, if I were to take a picture right now, let me just turn off autofocus. If I take a picture right now where it's saying it's properly exposed at 1/8, or actually it was at 2.8, so at 1/6, if I take a picture, it's just kind of a normal color. Now if I were to drop it down to fast shutter speed, it's going to be brighter. And then if I go the opposite way, it's going to be a little bit darker. Now you may not be able to see this in the video, but I'll go to a 3 stops underexposed, and as you can see, it's pretty much darker. If we go to 3 stops overexposed, it's going to be much brighter. And so those are just quick tips of, you know, combining your shutter speed and aperture. It's one thing that I always just recommend, go and play with, go around outside and mess with it. You know, the old saying, practice makes perfect. Even though it's kind of corny and stupid, it actually is a pretty valid point in this case. So remember, your first thing, whenever you're going to shoot, always look at your settings first. So of course, make sure you're in manual. I would suggest be at a low ISO if you're outside on a sunny day. If you're inside, I would suggest, you know, cranking up your ISO to maybe 400 and see at that. Next step would be choosing your aperture. So decide what your subject is, what you want the depth of field to be, if you want a really fast shutter speed, if you want a slow shutter speed, you know, as far as for depth of field or whatever. And then so after you choose what kind of depth of field you want, then, you know, just push the button halfway down, your shutter release button, and just follow the meter for your shutter speed. And if your shutter speed you know, isn't quite fast enough to be handheld, then, you know, change some more settings. Maybe you need less aperture, or you need a higher ISO, you may need a tripod, who knows. But whenever you go out and shoot, always check your ISO and decide your aperture, and then just let your shutter speed, kind of just let the camera tell you what it needs to be, and, you know, line up the exposure meter so it's proper, and you'll be good to go. And then if you're in a situation where, say you're shooting sports, you're going to want a fast shutter speed, of course. So what I would suggest is go to a fast shutter speed that you know. So say you want to freeze the action at a 500th of a second. Well, at 500th, even on a bright sunny day, you may not be able to be shooting at a high aperture. And with most sports, you want you know, pretty small depth of field. So then just choose the widest aperture you have so you can let the most light in. And then if you push the shutter halfway down and you're underexposed or maybe even overexposed, then maybe crank up the shutter a tad, or crank up your aperture to maybe, you know, a little higher. Or what most people do is on a bright sunny day, if you're shooting at a high ISO, you can get away with it without it being quite as grainy. So, you know, if you're shooting sports, choose your shutter speed. You know, usually pick your widest aperture. If you need a little more, crank up the ISO and you can get away with it. So I know this video wasn't too great, but hopefully that just kind of tells you how to combine all of this together in manual mode. And like I said, with this kind of thing, it's one of those things you want to go out and play with, you want to experiment with it, try different things, you know, try shooting a picture underexposed, overexposed, and properly exposed, and, you know, you'll see the differences. And so just remember, you know, to combine all these together, and to always be thinking about, you know, your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter speed. And if you remember all three of those things, and if you watch the previous tutorials and you remember all the facts about it as far as depth of field and motion blur and all that kind of good stuff, you should be able to now take a proper picture that you want to take and that the camera doesn't tell you. And, you know, if you're still having trouble and, you know, you have an important thing you want to photograph, then don't worry about all this stuff. Just set your camera to automatic and let it do, you know, what it's supposed to do, and it'll properly expose the picture for you. And so I hope this helps explain some of the basics of learning how to combine all this stuff together with the DSLR. And stay tuned for more videos, and also check out my other videos. And thanks for watching.